Manifesto, the comfort of not knowing. Condemn the voice if it speaks too bluntly. Condemn the accusation if it disturbs the quiet routines of denial. It will not matter. Power today no longer hides only in governments, armies, or written laws. It circulates through borders, markets, institutions, and the everyday habits of people who believe they are merely surviving. Power decides who breathes easily and who lives under constant pressure. It decides which populations are protected and which are left in zones of slow death. These zones are not accidents. They are social landscapes created through history. Communities that were once structured around kinship, land, and memory were broken apart by conquest, extraction, and outside control. Their local knowledge systems were weakened. Their political institutions collapsed or were reshaped to serve distant powers. The result is visible today in many regions that outsiders casually call underdeveloped. But the story does not end with the damage done by colonization and imperial ambition. Another layer of tragedy grows inside the communities themselves: impaired insight. Many people living inside these conditions no longer question the systems shaping their lives. Cultural narratives of defeat, suspicion, and resentment slowly replace traditions of responsibility and reflection. Social roles become rigid. Younger generations inherit confusion instead of clarity. Migration then becomes the visible outcome. People move across borders carrying memories of disruption, family trauma, and fragmented history. When they arrive in countries like Norway, they encounter new institutions, new rules, and new cultural codes. Host societies respond with suspicion. Immigration policies tighten. Public debate begins to link refugees with crime, poverty, and disorder. Yet both sides often misunderstand the deeper reality. The host society rarely acknowledges the historical forces that pushed these populations to move in the first place. And many immigrants, shaped by long histories of domination and institutional collapse, struggle to examine their own internalized patterns, learned helplessness, distrust of authority, and the erosion of critical inquiry. This is where existential avoidance begins. Instead of confronting difficult questions about identity, responsibility, and adaptation, many individuals retreat into pride, defensive narratives, and rigid cultural positions. Pride becomes armor. Obedience to inherited traditions becomes a substitute for reflection. Communities protect themselves through silence and conformity rather than honest conversation. Ignorance becomes convenient. People repeat simplified explanations about politics, religion, or culture without examining their origins. Social media amplifies these patterns, rewarding loud certainty over thoughtful discussion. Vincible ignorance, ignorance that could be corrected with effort, becomes widespread because curiosity is treated as a threat rather than a virtue. The consequences are visible everywhere. Dialogue collapses. Suspicion grows between groups. People retreat into cultural enclaves where criticism is forbidden and loyalty is demanded. Identity becomes a shield against self-examination. Yet culture itself was never meant to function this way. Human communities have always depended on dialogue, shared learning, and adaptation. Traditions were once living systems, shaped through conversation between generations. When these processes stop, culture becomes rigid performance rather than meaningful guidance. The manifesto therefore speaks harshly because the situation demands honesty. Blaming foreign societies for every hardship will not restore dignity. Blindly defending harmful practices will not rebuild communities. And host societies that ignore historical responsibility will continue reproducing the same cycles of suspicion and division. Awareness begins with a simple act: questioning the stories we have inherited. Immigrants must examine the beliefs and behaviors they carry with them. Host societies must confront the historical forces that shaped global inequality. Both must recognize that dignity requires more than economic opportunity. It requires intellectual courage. Dialogue, not denial, is the only path forward.
If I knew better, I move wiser. Prayers fighting predators, while I carry blame for broken systems and my own scars. Raised in a rigged world, I learned late that trust can be costly. So now I walk slower, reading hearts, avoiding smiles that hide motives.
Manifesto, The Comfort of Not Knowing Part 2. Condemn the accusation if it sounds harsh. Condemn the tone if it refuses to flatter wounded pride. It will not matter. The present world runs on a quiet hierarchy of life and death. Some populations are allowed safety, health, and stability. Others are pushed into zones of slow decay, places where conflict, environmental collapse, and economic extraction make survival uncertain. This arrangement does not only exist through laws or armies, it lives inside culture, institutions, and everyday assumptions about who belongs and who does not. When refugees or immigrants arrive in wealthy societies, the public narrative often reduces them to a single symbol. Violence, poverty, and disorder are casually linked to their presence. Regulations tighten, borders harden, policies appear that promise security and order. But the story rarely moves backward in time to examine the deeper origins of displacement. Many of the countries now labeled unstable carry long histories of external control. Land, minerals, labor, and knowledge were extracted through colonial domination and foreign monopolies. Local political systems were reshaped or destroyed. Education systems were redirected away from local memory. Over time, historical literacy weakened and communities lost the tools needed to understand their own past. This historical rupture created more than economic damage. It reshaped social identity. Families and communities began to adapt to conditions of uncertainty. Patterns of learned helplessness slowly emerged. When generations experience repeated exploitation and instability, they begin to believe that nothing they do can change their circumstances. Cultural pride turns defensive. Self-doubt grows beneath the surface. This psychological inheritance travels across borders with migrants. But here lies the uncomfortable truth. Historical trauma does not excuse intellectual stagnation. Too many immigrants arrive in new societies carrying pride without reflection. They defend every inherited custom without asking whether those customs still serve human dignity. They silence criticism with accusations of disrespect. Pride becomes a shield protecting ignorance. Communities begin to reproduce the same social patterns that damaged them in the first place. This is impaired insight. People fail to recognize the gap between their cultural narratives and the realities around them. Instead of adapting thoughtfully to a new environment, they retreat into rigid identity boundaries. They construct social enclaves where questioning tradition becomes taboo. The result is existential avoidance, a refusal to examine how history, culture, and personal behavior intersect. Ignorance becomes a habit. It is not the ignorance of illiteracy but a more dangerous form. Ignorance that could be corrected but is deliberately preserved. People choose simplified explanations over difficult inquiry. They blame host societies for discrimination while ignoring the need for self-critique within their own communities. Host societies, in turn, ignore the historical forces that created these conditions. Both sides remain trapped in incomplete narratives. Human communities have always evolved through dialogue. Cultural norms, kinship systems, and moral values were once discussed openly within councils, families, and social gatherings. Knowledge passed between generations through debate and storytelling. When these processes disappear, culture stops growing. It becomes performance rather than understanding. The manifesto speaks harshly because politeness has failed. Foreigners who cling blindly to inherited habits must confront the damage caused by stubborn pride. Host societies that reduce immigrants to stereotypes must confront the historical forces they helped create. Neither side can continue pretending that silence will solve the tension. Awareness begins when individuals abandon the comfort of not knowing. It begins when immigrants examine their traditions critically rather than worship them blindly. It begins when host societies acknowledge the global histories that produce displacement. It begins when both sides rediscover the ancient human habit of dialogue, slow, uncomfortable, and necessary. Without that dialogue, the machinery that decides who thrives and who withers will continue its work unnoticed.
If I knew better, I move wiser. Prayers fighting predators, while I carry blame for broken systems and my own scars. Raised in a rigged world, I learned late that trust can be costly. So now I walk slower, reading hearts, avoiding smiles that hide motives.
Manifesto. The Comfort of Not Knowing Part 3. Condemn the words if they sound cruel. Condemn the tone if it refuses to soften the truth. It makes little difference. The world already runs on a quiet hierarchy of life and neglect. Some communities receive safety, education, and stable institutions. Others are pushed into long corridors of instability where war, poverty, and environmental collapse slowly drain the possibility of dignity. Power today rarely announces itself loudly. It appears through border rules, economic pressure, and social narratives that quietly determine who belongs and who remains outside. Migration is one of the visible results of this long history. Families leave territories damaged by extraction, conflict, and unstable governance. They arrive in new societies with hope and determination, yet something else travels with them. Memories of disruption, cultural pride shaped by hardship, and social habits built for survival rather than reflection. These inherited patterns often collide with the expectations of the host society. This is where the second generation enters the picture. Children born in a new country grow up between two cultural worlds. At home, they inherit stories, traditions, and authority structures from their parents' homeland. Outside, they face the rules, symbols, and expectations of the society where they were born. They learn the language, the institutions, and the public codes of behavior, yet they are frequently reminded that their appearance, name, or background places them outside the imagined national identity. The result is identity tension. Young people begin asking questions that their parents often avoid. What does belonging actually mean? Does birth alone grant acceptance? Can a person carry multiple cultural identities without being rejected by both? These questions rarely receive honest answers. Instead, they encounter silence, pride, or moral lectures. This is where impaired insight appears. Many migrant parents refuse to examine the complexity of their children's experience. They view the host society primarily through the lens of economic survival. Food, employment, housing. From that perspective, the mission seems simple: work hard and ignore hostility. But the child born in that society experiences something different. The child must navigate social categories, racial boundaries, and cultural expectations every day. When parents dismiss these realities, the gap between generations widens. Young people feel misunderstood inside their own families while also facing suspicion outside them. They are told to respect tradition but also expected to integrate. They are reminded of their parents' sacrifices yet blamed when they struggle to define their own identity. Over time, this produces existential avoidance. People stop examining their confusion and instead adopt defensive roles. Some retreat into silence. Others adopt exaggerated identities. A few chase recognition through rebellion, violence, or performance. These responses are not random. They emerge from environments where belonging remains uncertain. When individuals cannot locate stable identity, they often search for substitute forms of recognition. Popular culture, street status, or ideological extremism can appear attractive because they offer immediate belonging. But pride without reflection becomes dangerous. Too many immigrant communities defend every inherited practice as sacred, refusing to examine whether those habits help their children navigate the modern environment. Criticism is dismissed as betrayal. Questioning elders becomes taboo. This stubbornness protects ignorance rather than dignity. Host societies carry their own blindness. Public debate often reduces migrants to simple stereotypes, either helpless victims or dangerous outsiders. Such narratives ignore the historical forces that produced migration and the internal struggles unfolding within immigrant families. Policies become stricter while understanding becomes weaker. Both sides remain trapped in incomplete explanations. Human societies have always evolved through conversation. Kinship rules, moral codes, and cultural values were once debated openly within communities. Dialogue allowed traditions to adapt while preserving dignity. When dialogue disappears, cultures freeze into rigid identities that no longer serve the people living inside them. This manifesto demands something uncomfortable. Immigrant communities must examine their habits with honesty rather than blind pride. Host societies must confront their prejudices and historical responsibilities. Second-generation youth must resist the temptation to hide behind anger or performative rebellion. Open dialogue is not weakness. It is survival. Without it, ignorance becomes permanent, and the machinery that decides who belongs and who remains alien will continue operating without resistance.
If I knew better, I move wiser. Prayers fighting predators, while I carry blame for broken systems and my own scars. Raised in a rigged world, I learned late that trust can be costly. So now I walk slower, reading hearts, avoiding smiles that hide motives.
Manifesto, The Comfort of Not Knowing, Part 4. Condemn the argument if it sounds harsh. Condemn the discomfort if it exposes truths people prefer to avoid. It will not matter. Power today rarely appears only through armies or laws. It lives inside social categories, borders, and the silent rules that decide who belongs and who must constantly prove they belong. Entire populations move through life negotiating these invisible lines. Migration did not begin with airplanes or passports. Human groups have always moved, following land, safety, and survival. But when movement happens after centuries of conquest, extraction, and broken institutions, it carries deeper consequences. Communities that experienced war, exploitation, and political collapse bring with them memories of survival. These memories shape family structures, moral expectations, and ideas about authority. Parents who endured deprivation often measure success through survival alone: food, shelter, and security. From that perspective, the struggle seems simple: work hard and ignore hostility. But children born in a new society experience a different reality. They must navigate cultural codes, racial categories, and expectations that question their belonging every day. This produces a tension between inherited identity and lived experience. Here lies the beginning of impaired insight. When families refuse to acknowledge this tension, misunderstanding grows between generations. Parents interpret their children's frustration as weakness or disobedience. Children interpret their parents' silence as indifference. Both sides begin avoiding deeper conversations about belonging, identity, and responsibility. This avoidance creates a quiet cultural distance within the same household. Over time, existential avoidance spreads. Difficult questions remain unspoken. Who am I within this society? What traditions should I keep? Which habits must change for survival here? Where does loyalty end and personal growth begin? Without honest dialogue, young people search elsewhere for answers. Some find them in healthy forms of expression, education, art, and community building. Others drift towards simpler identities that promise recognition, status culture, street hierarchies, or ideological certainty. These identities offer quick belonging, but rarely provide long-term clarity. Another problem emerges: vincible ignorance. This is ignorance that could be corrected through learning and discussion, but survives because questioning feels uncomfortable. Communities sometimes protect this ignorance with pride. Cultural habits become untouchable. Criticism is treated as betrayal rather than reflection. When this happens, traditions stop evolving and become rigid performances. Host societies contribute to the same cycle. Public debate often reduces immigrants to statistics, risks, or stereotypes. Instead of understanding the social history that shaped migration, people focus only on immediate differences. Suspicion replaces curiosity. Policies replace dialogue. Both sides remain trapped in incomplete stories. Human cultures have always grown through conversation. Values, customs, and identities were negotiated within families, councils, and gatherings. When these discussions disappear, societies lose the ability to adapt. Identity becomes a defensive wall instead of a living process. This manifesto is not an attack on migrants or host nations. It is a challenge to complacency. Immigrant communities must examine inherited habits with honesty rather than protect them blindly. Host societies must confront their own assumptions and historical responsibilities. The alternative is silence, and silence allows misunderstanding to grow. Awareness begins when individuals refuse to hide behind pride, fear, or inherited narratives. Dialogue may be uncomfortable, but it remains the only path toward shared dignity in a world where belonging is constantly being renegotiated.
If I knew better, I move wiser. Prayers fighting predators, while I carry blame for broken systems and my own scars. Raised in a rigged world, I learned late that trust can be costly. So now I walk slower, reading hearts, avoiding smiles that hide motives.
Manifesto, The Comfort of Not Knowing, Part 5. Condemn the voice if it refuses to decorate suffering with polite language. Condemn the argument if it forces uncomfortable reflection. It will not matter. Power today operates quietly through borders, markets, institutions, and the everyday beliefs that define who deserves security and who must constantly struggle to justify their existence. Entire populations are pushed into conditions where survival becomes the central achievement of life. Most people on this planet do not wake up hoping for poverty, exile, or displacement. Human communities generally pursue stability, food, shelter, kinship, and dignity. Yet the global order repeatedly produces the opposite. Wars erupt, economies collapse, environments degrade, and families are forced to move. Behind these events lie networks of power, political decisions, corporate interests, resource extraction, and ideological battles that reshape entire regions. But external forces alone cannot explain the full picture. Communities affected by these pressures often develop internal patterns that weaken their own resilience. Social disorganization, mistrust, and internal conflict begin to appear. Cultural knowledge fades as survival becomes the primary concern. Younger generations inherit fragments of history rather than coherent narratives about who they are and where they come from. This is where impaired insight emerges. People living inside difficult conditions sometimes lose the ability to examine the systems shaping their lives. Attention shifts toward immediate problems, daily survival, family obligations, and local disputes. The broader structure of power becomes distant and abstract. Communities may blame themselves or blame each other rather than investigate the deeper forces affecting them. At the same time, existential avoidance spreads. Difficult questions about identity, responsibility, and adaptation remain unspoken. People fear that questioning traditions or social habits will weaken group solidarity. Pride becomes a protective wall. Cultural practices are defended automatically, even when those practices limit growth or reinforce harmful patterns. Ignorance becomes convenient. Not the ignorance of lacking information, but the kind that survives because learning requires effort and humility. Invincible ignorance grows when communities choose certainty over inquiry. Rumors replace research. Emotional reactions replace discussion. Social media amplifies these patterns by rewarding dramatic claims and simple explanations. This behavior does not only affect migrants themselves, it also shapes how host societies respond. When immigrant communities appear closed, defensive, or unwilling to engage in dialogue, suspicion increases. Public debates become polarized. Policies grow stricter. Misunderstanding multiplies. The cycle feeds itself. Immigrants feel attacked and retreat further into cultural isolation. Host populations see this isolation as evidence of unwillingness to integrate. Both sides speak past each other rather than with each other. Yet human cultures have always evolved through conversation. Families once transmitted knowledge through storytelling and debate. Elders shared experiences while younger generations questioned them. Through this process, traditions adapted to new circumstances without losing their core values. That process must return. Immigrant communities must confront their own internal weaknesses, self-hate, fragmented knowledge, and resistance to criticism. Host societies must examine the historical forces that helped create global inequality and displacement. Neither side benefits from denial. The manifesto therefore rejects both victimhood and arrogance. Foreign communities cannot hide behind history while ignoring their responsibility to cultivate knowledge, discipline, and open dialogue. At the same time, dominant societies cannot pretend that the present global order emerged without their participation. Awareness begins when individuals recognize that identity is not fixed. Culture is not a museum artifact. It is a living system shaped through reflection and exchange. Dialogue may be uncomfortable, but without it, the machinery that produces alienation, ignorance, and division will continue its work unnoticed.
If I knew better, I move wiser. Prayers fighting predators, while I carry blame for broken systems and my own scars. Raised in a rigged world, I learned late that trust can be costly. So now I walk slower, reading hearts, avoiding smiles that hide motives.
Manifesto, The Comfort of Not Knowing, Part 6. Condemn the argument if it sounds ruthless. Condemn the tone if it refuses to disguise reality with comforting illusions. It will not matter. The present world is shaped by forces that decide who prospers and who struggles simply to remain alive. These forces rarely appear as visible chains. They appear through economic systems, migration patterns, cultural expectations, and the everyday beliefs that communities inherit without question. Across many regions of the world, people are pushed into fragile environments where survival is uncertain. Armed conflicts, political collapse, environmental damage, and unstable markets produce landscapes where families must constantly adapt. These are not isolated tragedies. They are patterns within the global system. Entire communities are placed in conditions where life slowly erodes through hunger, displacement, and uncertainty. Yet the deeper tragedy is not only material deprivation. It is impaired insight. Many people fail to recognize the complex structure shaping their lives. They inherit simplified explanations from elders, leaders, or religious authorities. Some believe the world operates today exactly as it did 40 years ago. Others imagine that divine intervention alone will solve economic and political crises. These beliefs offer comfort, but comfort does not produce understanding. This is how ignorance becomes normalized. Human communities pass down knowledge through stories, rituals, and shared memory. But when those stories stop evolving, they become rigid myths. Older generations sometimes cling to outdated ideas because those ideas once helped them survive. Younger generations, facing a different world of global markets, digital media, and rapid migration, find these explanations insufficient. Instead of honest conversation between generations, silence grows. Existential avoidance appears when communities refuse to examine uncomfortable realities. People prefer familiar narratives over difficult truths. They avoid discussing economic transformation, changing labor systems, or the cultural shifts created by migration. The result is confusion. Young people sense that the inherited explanations no longer match the world around them. Vincible ignorance follows. Information exists through education, research, and open debate, but individuals choose not to engage with it. Pride protects ignorance. Communities defend beliefs simply because they are traditional. Social pressure discourages questioning. Anyone who challenges these assumptions risks being labeled disloyal or arrogant. This pattern affects many migrant communities as well. Families arrive in new countries with strong cultural identities and survival strategies. These strategies once helped them navigate unstable environments. But when they encounter new social institutions, new economic systems, and new cultural expectations, adaptation becomes necessary. Too often, adaptation is resisted out of pride or fear. Stubbornness replaces reflection. Communities isolate themselves culturally while blaming external hostility for every difficulty. Host societies, observing this isolation, respond with suspicion and stricter policies. Both sides reinforce the cycle of misunderstanding. Meanwhile, the global economy continues its unstable rhythm. Since the late 20th century, the world has experienced waves of inflation, unemployment, financial crisis, and shifting markets. Nearly 1 billion people still live with severe hunger. Yet many individuals continue behaving as if economic reality were a permanent celebration. This denial benefits no one. Human societies survive through cooperation and learning. Cultural practices evolve when communities discuss problems openly. Knowledge grows when people accept that their understanding is incomplete. Dialogue between different groups is not a weakness. It is the mechanism through which societies remain stable. The manifesto demands a simple but difficult step: intellectual honesty. Foreign communities must examine their own habits with courage rather than hiding behind pride. Host societies must confront their prejudices rather than hiding behind stereotypes. Both must abandon the comfort of ignorance. If humanity continues choosing denial over dialogue, the machinery that decides who thrives and who withers will continue operating quietly. Awareness begins only when people are willing to question themselves as seriously as they question others.
Yeah!
Concrete blues painted on broken bones. Black rage inside these broken homes. Culture molds identity but leaves scars deep. Perceptions dictate how love or hate creeps. Poison mimics virtue, poison mimics virtue. Addiction disguised, neurons fire twisted truth. Chemical lies, brainstem hijacked. Reward pathways enslaved like cultural norms dictating who's saved. Ebola bleeds veins like broken trust inside. Hemorrhage dignity, immunity denied. Yellow fever's toxin burning through the night. Inflammation of culture, eyes blind to right. Malaria chills like cold stares reface. Prejudice fever, parasites of race. Low-income households shivering alone. Society's malaria seeps into bone. Poison mimics virtue like HIV's invasion. T-cells murdered slow, identity erosion. Cultural stigmas destroy immune defenses. Social norms infectious, break self-worth senses. Malnutrition and sorrow for belonging. Nerves misfire, serotonin drawn calling. Undernourished spirits hungry for validation. Neurologically driven towards social segregation. Illegal narcotics numb synaptic gaps. Dopamine enslaved, addiction traps. Neurotransmission warps, society high. Consumer culture dealers, genes we buy. Homeless identity, wandering alone. Neurophysiology altered in broken homes. Broken frontal lobes, decision impaired. Judgment clouded, community scared. Poison mimics virtue, ethnocentric pride. Oxytocin flowing wrong, inclusion denied. Multiculturalism masking intolerance beneath. History repeats, hatred clenched teeth. Social identity defined by false respect. Mirror neurons copy hate, empathy neglect. Cortex thickened, prejudice ingrained. Generational pain, neurologically maintained. Broken perception, shaping toxic behaviors. Dendrites tangle, social ties fractured, dangerous. Limbic system rage from broken beliefs. Cultural conditioning, no relief. Baloney not one, but integration's disease. Bad melding infections, Maya's decease. How we treat each other is neurologically ours. Yet we poison relationships, count social scars. Concrete blues tell tales through neural transmission. Black rage a response to systemic commission. Centuries of xenophobia, segregation deep. Neuroplasticity's potential buried asleep. Multicultural answers insufficient to heal. When racial intolerance remains all too real. Poison mimic virtue, hatred mask is pride. Cultural cortex calcify inside. Poison mimics virtue, truth masked in lies. Identity corrupted, belonging compromised. Culture sets norms, but capacities our choice. Neurophysiology proves hatred our voice. To heal society, confront neurological disguise. Poison mimic front of you, wake up, realize.